Hello there. My name is Rich Miller and I'm with the Center for Lakes and Reservoirs at Portland State University, and I'm looking around for native and non-native aquatic plants. And we're here at Muir Pond and Rooster Rock State Park, and there's a bunch of some native plants here, really nice community. This one here that looks like an arrow, this is called Wapato or arrowhead plant, and this is a really beneficial native aquatic plant. The Native Americans used to use the roots or the tubers of this plant for a food source, and tundra swans actually come in and they eat the roots and other beneficial aquatic plants. I'm going to talk about some of the different types or classes of aquatic plants that you can find in your lake, pond, reservoir, or along a river like the Willamette River. First off, the first type I'm going to talk about is an emergent aquatic plant. So this is a cattail here, an example of an emergent aquatic plant. It has roots down in the sediment, and it grows up out of the water and comes up and emerges out of the surface of the water. Hence the name emergent aquatic plant. The next type over here is an example of a floating leaf aquatic plant. This is Nymphaea odorata, or fragrant water lily, a non-native plant species. Floating leaf plants are rooted down in the sediment, and they have a stem that comes up, and then they have a floating leaf. Another example of a type of plant that kind of floats on the surface is a floating mat plant. They also have their roots in the sediment. They grow up, but instead of just having a flat leaf on the surface, there's kind of just this massive growth of aquatic plants on the surface there. And Ludwigia, the non-native Ludwigias are a good example of that aquatic plant. That's been causing a lot of problems in the Willamette River. When you get out deeper, or in between aquatic plants, in between floating leaf or emergent aquatic plants, you can have submerged aquatic plants. And just like the name says, they're growing down below the water surface, and you can occasionally have like little flowers coming up out of the top, out into the air, but most of the plant biomass is in the surface. And then one final type is a floating, completely free-floating aquatic plant. Duckweeds are an example of this, little tiny duckweeds. So they don't have roots that touch the sediment. They're just kind of free floating around the surface of the water. First off, it's pretty nice to have a source of water like a sprayer or something like this. So I tend to do a lot of my ID in my backyard with a garden sprayer. You can do this along the shore of your water body or anything like that, but when you pull up these aquatic plants, a lot of times they'll be covered in mud and algae, so it's really helpful to rinse them off. One thing, when you collect your aquatic plants, put them in a plastic bag labeled really well, and then you can put them on ice in a cooler, and then those plants can keep for maybe a week. They start getting a little bit smelly, but you can keep them in your fridge or out in a cooler with a little bit of ice for several days until you get to identification. Another tool that's really handy here is some sort of shallow tub, and this just happens to be lid to a tote. So water here is just a few inches deep, and with the aquatic plants, when you put them in water, their leaves will really spread out, and it'll show you the structure of the leaves, which is really important for identification. One of the basic key characteristics of identifying plants is how the leaves are structured around a stem. So we've got a couple different examples here. This one on the left, these leaves, the stem comes up here through the middle. There's a leaf here, a little bit stem, a leaf coming off the other side, leaf coming off the other side. This is called alternate leaves. I don't have an example of an aquatic plant with opposite leaves, but this is a mint plant, and this mint plant, you can see here, it has two leaves that arise from the same spot in the stem and go opposite each other. Another leaf arrangement is whorled leaves. So instead of having just 2 leaves at each node or where the leaves join the stems, this particular plant has 3 leaves in a whorl. And so that's a very key characteristic for distinguishing several different plants that really look like this particular plant on the right here, which is Canadian waterweed or Elodea canadensis. The one on the left here is a species of potamogeton, which there's a lot of different species of potamogetons. Right here we have 3 different species of potamogetons or pondweeds, and some of the key characteristics for distinguishing the species are the fruits up here. These are some, in this particular specimen, these are immature fruits, but kind of the shape that you would look with your hand lens of each individual fruit there will be indicative. Here is another example of the fruits. Another key characteristic for distinguishing them is whether or not they have floating leaves. This one in here in the middle in particular, these little bits here, if we were out in the wild, these would be floating on the surface. All these other leaves would be submerged below the surface. This particular one here, this is all completely submerged, and this one here is all completely submerged too, but sometimes the fruiting material will be coming up out of the water. Another key characteristic is the shape and the width of the leaves. So this particular one, it says a generic name is a thin leaf potamogeton, and there are characteristics like the fruits, and there's little characteristics at the joints of the leaves to help identify the different species of thin leaf potamogetons. For these ones with the bigger leaves, you can look at the tips of the leaves, whether they're pointy or rounded, the width, the number of not filaments, but the number of veins along the leaf. And then this other one here, this is a potamogeton crispus. So crispus is a curly leaf pondweed. There are some other potamogetons that have curly leaves, not quite as curly, but you could confuse it with the curly leaf pondweed. But one of the key characteristics is that this one has rounded ends to the leaves, as you can see right here in this guy and that one. Another key characteristic to just help distinguish between different potamogeton species is the way the leaves attach to the stems. In these particular instances, the one on the left, the one in the middle, and the one on the right, both of them are non-petioled. That means that there's not a stem, a little bit of a stem or a petiole that comes off and then the leaf branches out. The leaf basically comes all the way down to the stem. In particular, this curly leaf pondweed, it almost kind of wraps around the stem, and that's a really good key characteristic. Leaf shape is another characteristic to help you identify aquatic plants. On the right here, this is Elodea canadensis, the Canadian waterweed that we had mentioned before. It's in whorls of 3, and here I've clipped off one of the whorls to just show you the shape of the leaves a little bit better. You can see these leaves are really simple. They're directly connected to the stem. There aren't any big indentations or waviness or anything like that in the leaves, so that is one simple example of a leaf shape. This plant right here, this is called coontail or Ceratophyllum demersum. It's a native plant, just like the Elodea canadensis is a native plant. The leaf shape is a little bit different here in the coontail. The leaf coming off the stem, it branches, so it's a branching pattern, and it can branch several times on this particular plant. Another example is Myriophyllum. This particular species here is Myriophyllum spicatum, or Eurasian water milfoil, which is a non-native species. And even though it looks like there's a bunch more leaves here, this has 4 leaves in a whorl around the stem. And each of the leaves has a midrib and different leaf segments. So this particular one has almost 30 leaf segments. And then also you notice it has like this really flat end to the end of the leaves, so it almost looks like somebody clipped it off with some scissors. So that's a really good indicator that this is Eurasian water milfoil. Some of the native milfoil species will have fewer leaf segments and they'll have more of a rounded shape to the entire leaf rather than this clipped off end. Thanks for taking the time to learn more about aquatic plant identification. Hopefully some of these tips and tricks that we provided for you are really useful for you out there in the field. If you'd like to learn more about aquatic plant identification, there's some really good resources available to you. One of them is through the Benton Soil and Water Conservation District. They have an aquatic weed guide, which is great. Washington Department of Ecology has a online aquatic plant ID manual that is also very good. If you want to get into the more technical aspects, there's some keys available, including Flora of North America has a eFloris website, and then Jepson has a eFlora website also. Hope you get out there looking for aquatic plants, and hopefully you find only beneficial and native plants. Thanks again.